Hello there, guys. Sam Leterna here with another episode of Wrestle Tea. Today, I am super excited to introduce you a wrestler named Denver, Colorado, aka Drew Cordeiro, the founder of Beyond Wrestling, one of the premier independent wrestling promotions in the United States. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on. I think maybe more better known for my work as a promoter than a wrestler, but I guess during the pandemic, everybody is down to dabble. So
You got to plug everything, and is a jack of all trades, does a little bit of everything.
that's how you have to be in wrestling, though. If you're not a star wrestler, you have to know how to do everything else and do it well.
Absolutely. The more you know, the more useful you are, right?
Absolutely.
So, Drew, we had originally spoken on Twitter about having an interview where we could discuss a topic in depth. I did some brainstorming. I brought the idea of discussing scouting on the indies, and the current, events, I'd say, are very pertinent to this because a lot of indie talent have been getting snatched up from the indies real quick and, being put on AEW, New Japan, WWE. So let's get into the tea about this. You started Beyond Wrestling in 2009, and it's grown exponentially since then. You have 2 million subscribers on YouTube, worldwide following. How has the indie scouting process evolved since you began Evolve in 2009? And I'm talking intra-indie and also as far as like major televised wrestling goes.
Sure. So when we started Beyond Wrestling in 2009, kind of the function was I was involved in the backyard wrestling scene, and there were a lot of independent wrestlers that were professionally trained that preferred to compete in a backyard wrestling setting because they had more control over the environment. And what ended up happening was we were doing backyard shows all around the country, and it just got to a point where I felt like we need to do something bigger than this. And the first Beyond taping that we did was actually set up, under the guise of being a backyard show, but the only people that were invited had professional training. It was at a training facility with a ring, and we taped our first set of matches. We put them on YouTube, and it turned out that what we anticipated was we'll take these matches, these wrestlers can then take them to promoters to say, well, maybe you've seen me presented as, XYZ in this promotion, but this is what I really want to do. Here's proof that I can do it. But of course, being public, fans were able to see the matches, and it grew enough of a following where in 2011 we started doing more traditional live events. So it's just kind of funny because when we first started, we were doing no fan events intentionally, and that was part of our presentation. That was part of our hook. When some of the people that I came up with in the backyard wrestling scene no longer wanted to participate in Beyond Wrestling, and we still liked what we were doing, wrestlers that were active on our roster would reach out to other people, explain the opportunity and the potential of the project. And so more traditional, let's say, independent wrestlers, somebody like Chris Dickinson, who was trained but wasn't connected to our backyard wrestling scene, he'd find out about it through somebody like Eric Corvus. And, Corvus would say, hey, I've got 2 or 3 spots in my car. Anybody that shows up gets booked. There's no pay. But if you do well, the matches are going to go to YouTube. You can use it to get bookings with places like AIW and Evolve Wrestling and Dragon Gate USA. And essentially, that's what ended up happening. So that's where things started. And I'd say that the number one way to get booked is going to be having that connection to somebody that's already wrestling for us. Because they can vouch for you in a way where it's like, a fan may say, hey, this person is awesome and I want to see them. But there's kind of a vetting process where you have to figure out, what's going on behind the scenes. Is this person cool? Are they cooperative? Are they going to show up to try and contribute? Are they just out for themselves, out to make a buck? And, it's not a side that the fans really get to see. So, if somebody that already works for you, you already trust, puts their stamp of approval, that's going to go a long way.
Absolutely. And as far as, the numerous talents that you've had over the years participate in Beyond, did you ever have this like eureka moment where you thought, oh my God, so-and-so just got snatched up by WWE or even AEW recently? I think that this is going to start happening more often. And I think I have to maybe start guarding my talent and really, kind of enjoying the process of really having that talent at Beyond while they're there, right? Because a lot of people are not long for the indies right now and for the past 2 years, I feel like.
Well, again, when we first started, the idea was, hey, we want to use this platform to give the wrestlers the tools they need to get booked elsewhere, to present themselves the way that they feel like they can be successful. So I think the idea was always, well, we know that they're not going to complete their entire career arc with Beyond Wrestling, and the few that do are probably very special to our organization, that they've had that kind of loyalty. But it started escalating, especially within this last year, at a rate that was even faster than what I could have predicted. When we launched the Uncharted Territory series in 2009, that means in 2018, I was already able to detect, hey, something's happening that's going to disrupt the ecosystem of professional wrestling, specifically as it relates to coming up with talent on the independent scene. So if we used to do monthly shows, able to get our wrestlers in front of a crowd 12 times a year, if we can move to weekly shows, we can now accomplish in 3 months what would normally take an entire year. And my thought process with that is always, even if a professional wrestler is good, they need to have that connection with the crowd. I always felt the sweet spot was like, you have to really like run with this person for 6 months at the very least, with their ups and downs, until the crowd has seen them enough that they have that connection, and then you can really build from there. And I think that when you look to the first 2 seasons of Uncharted Territory, when you see the wrestlers that maybe were, let's say, unknowns, or the fans had lost a connection with, to see kind of the success that they're having now. I mean, the big success stories coming out of the first season of Beyond Wrestling Uncharted Territory were Bear Country and Thomas Santel. I mean, Bear Country's gotten opportunities all over the country, and I think that if they weren't a tag team, because I think that tag team wrestling just isn't featured as much, I think that they probably would be even farther. Thomas Santel, had tons of, big stuff down the pipeline. Unfortunately, he got sidelined with an injury. You can't control that. And then when you look to season 2 of Uncharted Territory, you see Layla Hirsch and Christian Casanova. We know Layla Hirsch has been working very closely with AEW right now. And again, the industry is going to have ebbs and flows based upon what obligations the television companies have. So if AEW, for example, has 25 tag teams already, it's going to be tougher for Bear Country to get in line. Whereas if they have openings on their women's roster, it's going to be easier for somebody like Layla Hirsch to get an opportunity. So it does have just as much to do with timing sometimes as it does talent. Top talent, Christian Casanova, he's somebody that got so many opportunities this year, Black Label Pro, being able to do the collective, obviously somebody that was featured in Beyond Wrestling. And I think that he's somebody that if it wasn't for the pandemic, we'd already see him in a role at a television organization. And there's plenty of other wrestlers that came through Uncharted Territory and really built their name. I mean, somebody like Chris Dickinson had a complete revitalization of his career for his run of matches leading to the match with Daisuke Sekimoto at American Rana. He has so many unbelievable opportunities coming up, and I think that it's because he's somebody that we had seen for such a long period of time at Beyond Wrestling that maybe the fan base had taken him for granted. So again, if you have now all of a sudden week after week after week just beating people over the head with the fact that this person is here to say this person's legitimate, you become undeniable. And I think that kind of goes to the second season of Uncharted Territory with John Silver taking a similar path where, Silver obviously has a lot of versatility in terms of how silly he is, but he's also so explosive in the ring, and being able to see that performer week after week after week. So I do think that with WWE picking up people at an unprecedented rate, it puts AEW in a position where they also need to kind of keep up. And then you have the other companies that have television obligations, like Ring of Honor, like Impact Wrestling, like MLW, that also need to sign people to contracts, because they have to fulfill obligations because that's where their money's coming from. It's tough. It's extremely tough to keep up. And with the pandemic throwing a wrench into our plans, we were originally supposed to be doing, starting in April, a full year of Uncharted Territory. So instead of, it would have been broken up into seasons, but it would have been continuous. Instead, and then with our monthly specials, we probably would have ended up doing about, my guess is close to 50 shows just in 2020 alone. We've only been able to do 5. And so when I look at the wrestlers that we've still had the opportunity to work with that have already gone on to do bigger things, it's like I never got to sink my teeth into an Anthony Bowens or a Max Caster. They already have a contract with AEW, and it's pretty obvious that they already had the tools even prior to coming to Beyond Wrestling, but they never even got that chance to make that connection with the crowd. So like when I go on Reddit a lot of times, like you'll see somebody like Orange Cassidy and you'll be like, look at this funny thing Orange Cassidy did, whether it's a short clip or a GIF. And a lot of time you see that Beyond Wrestling watermark in the corner. And it's like, it's cool. People know like where, you know, even though he had been wrestling for, you know, more than a decade before he started with Beyond Wrestling, the Orange Cassidy character really took off at Beyond Wrestling. So it's cool that people are able to see that connection. With Max Kastner and Anthony Bones, like I think combined, maybe they did 8 matches for Beyond Wrestling. And it's just like, I know that those are two guys that I really wanted to work with. But they've already gotten the opportunity. So it's like really, I don't want to say it's bittersweet. Again, that's the function of Beyond Wrestling, is to always give the wrestlers the tools they need to get to the next level. But at some level, our platform needs to have value intrinsically on its own. And if we can't keep up with having enough wrestlers on our roster that the fans have a connection with, whether it's because we're not able to schedule shows as often as we'd like, or whether it's because, you know, there's just not the same type of talent that I have a vision for at my disposal, that's something that I do get concerned about. So it's tough to keep up right now. And if it's tough for us to keep up, especially with our track record, I can't even imagine what it's like being other promotions, kind of, you know, all fighting in the same space.
Yeah. Well, as far as I guess putting, let's say, the wrestlers over the brand or the brand over the wrestlers, this conversation's been had with, I guess, the way WWE has more recently been doing their shows over the past couple of years, where it doesn't seem like there's one specific star that's really above the rest, right? It seems like the brand is what they want the fans to buy into. Is that something that you feel like you would have to do at Beyond moving forward if the pandemic continues, if the talent pool continues to shrink? How are you adjusting as a promoter to this unprecedented?
No, I don't like that mentality, because if you don't let somebody like The Rock go off to be the biggest star in Hollywood, how can you capitalize on him coming back to wrestle John Cena 2 years in a row and his sporadic appearances, which is definitely the format that they are super reliant on now. You know, I think about it, 10 to 15 years down the line, who's the person that's going to be coming in to get like that? Oh my God, can you believe they're back for WrestleMania? And it's like, I know the ratings aren't the end-all be-all, but I do think that over a long period of time, there's a consistent way to track popularity on some levels. And it's like, not as a knock on anybody, but if Kofi Kingston comes out of retirement 10 years down the line to wrestle, you know, somebody that maybe hasn't even debuted for them yet, he's never been able to reach the type of popularity that somebody like The Rock did. So that's not a knock on Kofi's talent. I think he's unbelievable, but I just using him as the example, I think that maybe sets a ceiling as far as like, well, how many people, you know, that are Laps fans are going to come back? How many people are going to feel like this is important? So I don't believe in that at all. I think that especially the Beyond Wrestling brand exists based on the track record of how many different wrestlers have gotten opportunities because they had their breakout moment in a Beyond Wrestling ring. Somebody like Keith Lee was, you know, grinding it out for 10 years in Texas. He had already had multiple WWE tryouts. He came to Beyond Wrestling in his one match with Donovan Dijak. We had to bring him in the very next month. And, you know, it's like the joke about, you know, it takes 10 years to become an overnight sensation. But he was ready. He wasn't overexposed. He got his big opportunity. 2 years later, we're having his farewell show. Somebody like Martin Stone, Danny Burch, he had been a longtime veteran of the UK. He went to WWE. He was in NXT. They ended up cutting him. He didn't even wrestle for us for a full year. I think he had 8 or 9 matches. And it was like already they were knocking on his door like, hey, yeah, like you rebuilt yourself. You have to come back. So again, like, I don't think it's any individual wrestler that should define the brand. That's just my own personal mentality. That's just always what Beyond Wrestling's function has been. And I've tried not to stray away from it. So I don't think there's a scenario where we say, hey, this is our one person and we're going to lock them down and we're going to prevent them from bigger opportunities. Unless there's ever a scenario where Beyond Wrestling has so much money coming in that it's like, hey, you know what? I can give you $100,000 a year or match whatever an entry level contract is going to be so that you can be, you know, a tent pole for us that we can build our organization around. In which case, yeah, maybe for somebody that is life-changing money and maybe that is a life-changing opportunity. We're just not at that point. So I see no problem with continuing to put the wrestlers themselves above the brand. And that's the challenge, is keeping up with it and continuously being able to identify, you know. I look at, I know it's kind of silly, but the cagematch.net is like such a useful resource for me to be able to just like see, hey, who's wrestled for us the most this year, and be able to go through and look at all of our results, because it's just something that we don't catalog internally. It would just take a lot of time. So, and it already exists, so there's really no function. So I'm like a huge proponent of cage match, and I look at that a lot as like, okay, who is getting their reps in, who is, you know, wrestling for the most different companies, who is somebody that maybe is good but isn't getting the opportunities that they deserve. You know, if this person is wrestling a ton for GCW, you know, if I bring them into Beyond Wrestling, will people associate them with GCW, and so they come in as a special attraction for us? Is it somebody that maybe, if they're presented differently, like Nick Gage is a perfect example. Gage is everywhere, right? So why would you want to see Gage in Beyond Wrestling versus Gage in GCW? Well, if Gage is known for his death matches and GCW is running those and we don't really run them as much, then, well, what's a side of him that people don't normally get to see? And like, he had told me specifically, like, I really like doing character stuff. I really like doing story stuff. I don't get a lot of opportunities to do it. And then it's like his partnership with Thomas Santel, who's like a totally different end of the you know, the spectrum in terms of character and presentation. And now it's kind of like you have a fun mismatch where you can only see it in Beyond Wrestling. So, you know, you just have to get creative with what you have. And I think that's one of the reasons that Beyond Wrestling has had such a strong track record over the years, is because you have to work with the expectation that the talent is constantly going to be out the door. As far as how it relates to the pandemic and the inability to schedule shows, you know, I keep looking at, hey, here's all the people that we worked with. Here's who I want to work with that I haven't yet. And that's like something that I update every 2 or 3 weeks, because I don't know when we'll do our next show.
Yes. Well, we are, we're certainly living in unprecedented times, not only for the world, but also for independent wrestling. But I do think that it's promoters like you that have a certain exposure level in terms of your brand and what you've built that really keep independent wrestling going. I know there's kind of been a debate on Twitter. There's always a debate of some sort on Twitter about, you know, should the indies keep running? Should they not keep running during the pandemic? But it's easy to, you know, give an answer of, hey, like, these guys shouldn't be running shows, people shouldn't be wrestling, when you're not like truly involved in the mix, right? And like, there's so much at stake right now for indie wrestling that I think it's easy for a lot of fans to kind of just have that go over their head and only think of safety. Like, just because it's wrestling doesn't mean it's any different from any other job that is at risk because of the pandemic in the United States.
Sure.
Now.
But I don't think that those have to be two mutually exclusive ideas. And I know that you were in attendance for the shows that we did at the Boardwalk in Atlantic City. And I felt, I mean, you know, you got to think, my day job, I run a food truck. Yeah. So I'm constantly in situations where it's high volume, you know, hundreds of people getting served as quickly as possible. Thankfully, for the most part, we operate in an outdoor situation. But I can honestly tell you that the Beyond Wrestling shows that we've been able to run since the start of the pandemic have been what I have felt to be my safest experiences being in the public, because I have complete control over what's going on. If somebody's not wearing a mask, it's not like when I'm in the supermarket and somebody doesn't have a mask on and they're breathing down my neck and it's like, do I say something? Is this going to start a fight? Like, you know, if somebody is at one of my shows and they don't have a mask on, I remove them because I'm in charge. So I can control the safety of the situation. I definitely had concerns, though, as far as running indoors. And, I mean, the fact of the matter is, you know, after, you know, there was the perception that there were positive cases coming out of the collective, people didn't, even though we weren't involved in that, we as an industry lost the faith of the people that we could safely produce shows because we hadn't had incidents prior to that. And so all of a sudden, our ticket sales completely dropped off. All of a sudden, people are asking us for refunds. And then we want everybody to get tested before the show. So now if other, let's say, parties within the industry where our wrestlers also work are now saying, hey, you know, before it was cool for you to take dates, but now we have concerns because of safety protocols, those wrestlers are now being, let's say, not pulled off the card, but maybe pressured to weigh their options. I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible. And then it's like, okay, well, we still want to put on a card of a certain standard because it's Beyond Wrestling, and people hold it in high regard for a reason. Well, we want everybody on the show to be tested. So now when you have gaps in your lineup, it's like, oh no, like well, how can we make sure that this person gets tested in time, but still be able to put on a full card, but still also put on a card worthy of what we're charging for tickets? The whole thing fell apart, you know? I don't want to sound cocky, but for myself personally, we have the luxury of making that decision. A lot of other people don't, and they feel like they have to run. And we have the benefit of having our YouTube channel, which, like you said, has more than 2 million subscribers. Our goal is 3 million before the end of the calendar year. And we've seen unprecedented growth on our YouTube channel. And that's an asset that we have that not a lot of other people have. So that's why I keep coming back to like trying to explain to people, like, just because we don't have like a live event announced for February that we're constantly announcing matches for, like, that's the mentality that fans have been conditioned to. So it's like, well, if that's not happening, then they don't exist. And it's like, no, like, look at this incredible catalog that we have to fall back on of all of these wrestlers that have gone on to do unbelievable things in the industry. Like, now these matches get a second life because our is continuing to grow every day. Hang tight, be patient, trust the process, and know that when the time comes for us to start producing new events with new wrestlers who we have the same hopes for will get to those levels, it's because we have something that nobody else has in our YouTube channel, which again goes on to launch all of these different careers, and that's what we want to get back to. But I don't think the idea of like having to run and then like being safe, like, I don't think there's like even a compromise on that. I think there's a way to do that. And like, I can't get into it. I wish I could like drop an exclusive on your show, but like, I know that I haven't been doing a lot of like front facing, like, hey, public announcements as far as like what I've been working on, but we have kind of a project that I've been working on for, honestly, going back to March of 2019, but now it's moved off the back burner. It's right in front of me. And, it's one of those things where it's like, it could be something that we work on for months and it never materializes, which is why I'm hesitant to say anything. But I feel like, based on my experience and my level of perception, I've looked at all of the problems that the independent wrestling world is facing right now. Is it safe to attend these events? How are you losing talent at an unprecedented rate? What happened to the storytelling? Everything feels like an exhibition card. And I feel like I've come up with a format that is going to solve all of these problems. And it's just a matter of being able to cross the T's, dot the I's, get all of our ducks in a row in order to be able to actually move forward and execute what my vision for professional wrestling is, that will thrive in a 2021 climate where you have to know, hey, 75% of the people that I had a chance to work with before the pandemic started are probably wrestling on TV now. And that's not something that you fight. You have to reposition yourself. Maybe it's not safe to stage shows with, because like, if we can get everybody on our crew and everybody, wrestling tested, I can't tell fans that they have to get tested. So it's not to say you remove the fans from the equation, but like, look what WWE did with the Thunderdome. That's something where they have resources far beyond what we'll ever have in order to be able to figure out how to produce wrestling that still has an atmosphere between the audio track and then also having people reacting in the background. Like that's pretty clever. I'll give them credit for that. We don't have that, so what's our version of that? If it's a scenario where we then move back to, like the wrestling shows where there's no fans in attendance, that's something that we were known for. That doesn't mean that there's no audience, but how do we create an environment that still has atmosphere, that's still lively? So these are the things that I'm like obsessing over every single day, fine-tuning in my head, meetings with countless other people. I take a walk with my dad every night to kind of tell him the idea and just kind of bounce it off him because he's not really a wrestling guy. And I'm like extremely excited, but I also know like in wrestling, like things can fall apart like that. So like, I'm not trying to get my hopes up, but I look at it like this: if this project doesn't materialize, we're still in such a better position than almost everybody else because of what we have with, our partnership with IWTV, with our YouTube channel. And I don't want to say that I'm not worried, but it's like, this is the idea that I want to run with. If it's not, if I have to go to a plan B or a plan C, we're still going to be in the same position that we were in terms of finding wrestlers that we can get to the next level. And that's what will define Beyond Wrestling as a brand.
And for your projects in the future, particularly this one that you can't speak about, are you like leaning towards or leaning in rather, on these new fans that have recently discovered the indies because of all of the talent that's now on AEW, on WWE, people like Orange Cassidy, people like Chris Statlander, et cetera, that are bringing more of an awareness of indie wrestling for the casual, WWE style.
I'm gonna say no, because the first time that like Statlander and Orange Cassidy were on AEW and we still had a chance to work with them, we did a show in Foxborough right outside of Gillette Stadium in January, and there were over 400 people there, and like we had to like extend intermission and then also like make an announcement like, hey, they'll stick around after the show to sign autographs. And I think that, even looking at January now in November, things have changed so much that we don't have that connection anymore. Like, that's how fast things are moving. So I don't even know what value there is specifically of wrestlers that have competed for us that have now gone on to bigger things, unless we're the ones constantly patting ourselves on the back and tooting our own horn, saying like, hey, remember this person? Which I think is kind of a corny look at times, but it's like sometimes you'll get the credit from other people, other times you won't, and like you still need to make that connection. No, it's about looking forward, and I think that I don't think that there are necessarily new independent wrestling fans. I think that legitimately, like, people don't realize that being an independent wrestling fan, oh man, this is gonna sound like I gotta find the right way to say it, because I don't want to say it the wrong way. Being an independent wrestling fan is such a small community. If I had to wager a guess, I would say in the United States, there are probably less than 20 to 25,000 people that are independent wrestling fans. But independent wrestling dictates the trends. So that's like saying, I'm not much of a media guy outside of wrestling. I really spend a lot of time on wrestling. But like, give me like a property or a brand in entertainment that's like hot right now.
Let's see. I'm not very big on things outside of wrestling either, but
like TV, movies, like.
Well, I know like the whole like Marvel comic.
Okay, and so that was exactly the thought that that was my thought process too. Imagine if you're one of 20 or 25,000 people that is able to say, hey, this is the next superhero movie that I want to see. This is how I want to see this person presented. This is how I want to see these people interact. Maybe this character isn't suited for a movie. Maybe they're better having a relaunched comic series or a video game. There's so many people that follow the Marvel stuff that it's like, at the end of the day, the people that create the content are the ones that making the decisions. In professional wrestling, it's the total opposite. So it's almost a privilege. I didn't want to use that word, but it is almost a privilege to be an independent wrestling fan, because you have so much control over what it is that you want to support. And so there's a power to that. You know what I mean? And that's something that makes independent wrestling so unique. And so when you say, like, are there, all of these new fans that got brought in as a result of the popularity, my fear is that when you see an organization like WWE and then, for years, oh, the independent wrestling scene stinks. You have to be a former football player or a model from a magazine in order to be a wrestler. And then all of a sudden, it's like they're doing this, and then independent wrestling is creeping up. And then it's finally like independent wrestling can't be denied. Like, it's right here. So they co-opt it. And they create NXT. And then every month, it's like the hottest free agent on the indies is getting signed to get brought over. And it's like, by co-opting it, now all of a sudden AEW is able to form because WWE has given so much credibility to what wrestling can be outside. But they can't contain it. And they can't control every single style. So AEW forms. And now AEW is kind of the same position to WWE, where it's like, okay, we have this television contract. We have hours of TV that we have, to fulfill through contractual obligations. We want to launch another show. We want to expand globally. And so these wrestlers are getting pulled away too. This is my fear. And this is for everybody that's watching. I want them to promise that they will stick through independent wrestling, through all of the ebbs and the flows. My fear is that when AEW and WWE get everything that they want out of the indies, that they're going to stop co-opting it. They're going to go to a different strategy of cultivating talent. And the people that watch their favorites, whether it was El Generico or Kevin Steen or the American Dragon, AJ Styles, now that they're all in top organizations, those fans will say, well, I don't know who this person is on the indies, so I'm just going to follow my favorites on TV wrestling. And then because TV wrestling is no longer co-opting the indies, that's where it's going. That's inevitably where it's going. It may take a few more years, and there still may be prospects that, like, if they're undeniable, they're going to get to TV no matter what their path is. But I think ultimately what we're looking at is that TV is going to stop messing with indie wrestling, and I'm afraid that that's going to remove the value of independent wrestling. So at that point, it's like, well, where are you going to cultivate new fans from? How are people going to follow it? When we were doing Uncharted Territory, that was the biggest period of growth that we ever saw in Beyond Wrestling history, because we were running weekly, so we were super accessible. We dropped our ticket prices to $10, so we were super accessible, and our shows were good. So somebody would come that was a wrestling fan, and then the next week they literally show up with 5 or 6 friends being like, yo, it's just $10, like, give it a try. And then all of a sudden, so you know, this is my advice to all the independent wrestling promoters. It's like, you know, talent, cool, talent comes and goes. Like, talent is everything, but you have to figure out how to put the pieces of the puzzle in place to make the entry point to become a fan as accessible as possible. And that's where, you know, we don't have the luxury of running every week now because of the pandemic. So we have to figure out what that entry point is. Again, lucky that we have almost 3 million YouTube subscribers. YouTube is the second biggest website in the world. So we're more accessible than most. But when I keep thinking about this new concept, if fans aren't in attendance because of safety reasons, man, doesn't that put up a barrier right away? How do you make it accessible? If fans aren't familiar with the people that are going to be competing on the event, that sets up another barrier. So those are the things that you have to be, like, extremely mindful of, to me, when it comes to... I'm never like, oh my God, wouldn't this be a cool card? And then we run the show. It's always like, I need to achieve XYZ in advance. This is the card that I think is going to do it. So, you know, I hope that makes sense. And if anything, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that the mainstream wrestling continues to shine that spotlight on independent wrestling, because, again, we dictate the trends that go upstream. It's not the other way around, and it's very unique to our industry. So I think it's very, very cool to be able to be an independent wrestling fan.
Absolutely. Well, my only maybe hole in that argument would be, what's going to happen inevitably rather, when all of this talent that's just, you know, kind of standing stagnant in NXT, maybe not getting used on TV, but were super big on the indies, what's going to happen when those people either want out of their contracts, wind up getting released, and wind up back on the indies? You know, that I think that could be a moment where those, you know, major companies like WWE, AEW, get those fans trickling back into the indies, these new casual fans. You know, I know we don't really they can come and become fans of indie wrestling, but if you guys are dictating the tide of pro wrestling as a whole, then those people kind of funneling back into the indies could be a positive thing as well.
My fear is that what we've seen with all of the major releases from WWE is that people that had a following landed on their feet in other television organizations. Mm. You know, somebody like Brian Myers goes to Impact. Somebody like Deanna goes to Impact. Somebody like Tay Conti goes to AEW. Somebody like Miro Rusev goes to AEW. And then there's other people like Rowan only had his first match a couple weeks ago for Primetime Wrestling. That does the Tuesday Night Live events on Fight. I don't think Aiden English has had any bookings. And I don't know if that's because they want to stay away from the spotlight to pick their time, because if there's like a flood of talent, it can be hard to stick out. I don't know if it's because of the pandemic. There's not as many shows that are happening. It's certainly not a lack of talent. Like, Aiden English would be my number one person, where it's like, if things were normal, like him versus Max Caster was the match. You know what I mean? Like, they both, you're right, of course, it's like, it's such a no-brainer. And then that's like, you know, when I think about like my booking mindset, it's like, okay, Max Caster's somebody they want to elevate. You know, he doesn't always need to win because he stays over with his talent, but you know, now all of a sudden you have a dynamic where there's something extremely interesting based on what their backgrounds are, like the type of match that they would have, especially like, you know, for somebody like Aiden English to come back to the indies and get kind of reacclimated to the style, knowing Max training. It's just like, that's like on paper, like such a home run. You know, I think there's fan intrigue. It's just not something that's going to happen now. And I just don't know. I guess my fear is that if these people that are like, I don't think WWE let anybody go that, I don't know. I don't want to say this in an insulting way, but on their end, I don't think that there was perceived value. And so in some situation, my fear is that like if WWE is letting people go, then again, apologize for the choice of words. They're damaged goods. So it's hard for them to then reinvent themselves in the eyes of the fans. And especially right now without you know, consistent shows, it's more difficult process to be able to rehab your career. I think that Deonna Purrazzo is somebody that because of her lack of even appearing on WWE, never was damaged. So it's like it's easy for her to go to Impact and immediately be slotted right at the top because it's just like, how could they have done nothing with her? You know, like how stupid are they that they had this basically in a silver platter and they let it slip through their fingers? Whereas on the other hand, you know, some releases is kind of like, you know, and I won't name anybody by name, but it's just kind of like, oh, this is the person that lost all the time on WWE. Like, I don't want to see them. You know, I'd rather see somebody new. And I'm not denying what you say. And it's like with Zelina Vega being released, we really don't know long term if it is going to get to the point where WWE actually has 50 or 100 people extra, where you know there could be this massive shift at some point. But even like the people that AEW let go, you know, they're on the other side of the world. They don't have the chance to be like a mover or a shaker or do anything right now. And that's been a super small number compared to WWE. So you're more hopeful than I. I'll leave it at that.
I always try and stay positive when it comes to wrestling, even though
I try and stay as negative as possible.
well, it keeps the cogs moving in your brain.
Exactly. Oh, constant problem solving. Now, I'm in a field of problem solving. So.
Yes. Well, before we end this interview, I do have one final question, and this is in relation to the time-honored tradition of having veteran wrestlers kind of impart their knowledge to the greener wrestler or the wrestler on the rise. Do you think that because so many people are getting scooped up by these major television companies that there's going to be an issue or maybe like a loss in translation with passing that knowledge and training and kind of how would I say it, turning someone from just a wrestler into an indie star?
Yep. Right now it's the blind leading the blind because there's such a lack of access to veteran wrestlers. Like legitimately, like, you know, I don't know, what was it, last year or 2 years ago when WWE signed like a ton of like random people just to be like producers, and it's just kind of like, well, did they need them as producers or is it just to starve the indies of, you know, any sort of veteran connection? And there's less and less of that, and there's less and less reputable schools. You know, unfortunately, it seemed like there was a lot of mismanagement, which came to light with the Speaking Out movement, and you know, it's unfortunate but necessary because as a wrestler, safety is the number one thing. You have to be safe at the place that you're training. That's going to end up being your home. You know, you lose a place like Lance Storm's school because he closes it to go to WWE to get laid off. You know, I think that the number one school in the country right now is probably the Creative Pro School in New York. I think that between their connections with Pat Buck and Brian Myers, between WWE and Impact, and then, you know, the people that are also connected to AEW and seeing that wrestlers coming out of their school like MJF and Chris Statlander and Max Caster are doing well on TV, like that would be the number one spot that I would recommend. But that only solves the problem for like a super small amount of potential wrestlers. And what you're seeing is like a lot of wrestlers will just turn to the internet to like build up their own fan base. And they're successful in doing that. But to me, that's short money because when you get the opportunity, you're going to either know how to wrestle or you're not. And if you don't know how to wrestle, you'll get one opportunity and then they'll say, okay, who knows how to wrestle? So I don't have advice on how people need to go through the process of getting trained properly, getting their reps in, actually learning the craft, the art. You know, we want to protect the sanctity of what pro wrestling is. And I don't have a solution for that. And I think, you know, at one point I used to joke WWE is going to go buy all the reputable schools in the country and then they're going to put their name on it. And now all of a sudden, when a school charges what, like $2,500, $3,000 for tuition, I don't know. You know, I'm sure it varies. But now it's like all of a sudden, like that money's going to WWE. So whereas WWE right now has to pay to scout people because like they'll bring them in for a tryout, put them up in a hotel, give them developmental deals. I think that the whole thing is going to change at some point where now you'll have to, it's like going to a trade school, you know? If I want to be a banker, I have to go to college, you know, for at least 4 years, then maybe get an MBA or whatever, and then, you know, apply my craft. You pay all that money. I think that at some point it's going to get switched. Instead of WWE paying to scout people, you're going to be paying to get scouted by WWE. And that's going to just close off more access to veterans, and really just kind of bottleneck things into like one specific way of doing it. So I have concerns about that. And I think that, you know, a place like Beyond Wrestling, sometimes it's frustrating that we don't get maybe the credit that I feel like we deserve. But at the same time, I think that because we don't have a specific affiliation with one place or another, we're still able to just kind of like, hey, this is what we want pro wrestling to be and we can do it. Whereas if it's like, if we became a developmental league for AEW or something like that, now our function is to satisfy what their needs are. So it limits what it is that we can present. So, man, I don't know. Veterans that are out there. I mean, you know, somebody like Chris Hero has been radio silent pretty much since he got released, but I think that he would probably be the single biggest resource if he decided to start doing clinics or open a school. Man, there's so few veterans right now. It's an unprecedented time in wrestling because wrestling moves so rapidly. But if there are veterans, like, you have to seek them out. You can't just wait till they're on their deathbed just to put out a couple tweets to say how much you like them, you had fun with them at shows. Like, you actually have to like go out of your way to constantly be like in their business to learn as much as you can, because somebody has to pass that torch. And it goes back to what I was saying. I think that when the TV companies get everything they want out of the indies, like, the TV companies still have some of the greatest minds in wrestling at their disposal. So it's like, you know, if you're a wrestler that, you know, if you're a college football player, you know nothing about wrestling, you can still go to WWE and learn from Norman Smiley. If you're somebody that wants to, fresh out of high school, train to be a professional wrestler, whose school are you going to go to? You know, like, somebody that's been wrestling 3 years, they shouldn't be running a school. You know, somebody that should have already had a 20+ year run that's met people and has been connected and knows the right way to go about doing things. I mean, that's partially why I was really amped up that we were going to open the Beyond Wrestling School. Over the past couple of years, we did a couple, I don't know, you call it a seminar, clinic, where we would do, Chris Dickinson would handle the training in terms of the in-ring stuff. I would give some advice in terms of character, social media, how to put it together. And then because of the Beyond Wrestling no fan format, we would actually tape matches that were kind of like, hey, here's your tryout matches. And then we would actually stage a show similar to one of our studio tapings. And I found those to be like super valuable experiences. So the plan for our school was going to be, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we would do training, and then the Thursday would be Uncharted Territory. So not only would you learn how to be a professional wrestler, but on the Thursday you'd have the opportunity to learn all of the different, you know, elements of what goes to putting a show together. Because not everybody that trains to be a wrestler becomes a wrestler, but that doesn't mean that they don't have value within the professional wrestling industry, and there's not a different role that they can find. You know, and then having access to special guests, whether it would be a Tracy Williams or a Drew Gulak, who are still in the prime of their career, you know, to be able to come in and kind of give a different perspective. You know, I think that something like that would have been ideal. But again, I think that those types of scenarios are so few and far between. Even with the best plan in the world, we weren't prepared for the pandemic to kind of blow it all to hell. So I wish I had better advice for rookies in wrestling right now. The best thing that I can say is, like, you have to study your tapes. You have to stay in good shape. Like, you as much as you want to hustle t-shirts and you know, cameos and stuff like that, like, you have to really understand that wrestling is about the wrestling. And if you do not have a solid grasp of the fundamentals, when you do get your opportunity based on your popularity on Twitter, you're not going to get brought back. So you want to be brought back because you want to make as much money as you can while your body will hold out. So I hope that helps. That's me as my sage veteran advice, who's done one match in the last 15 years on a backyard wrestling show for GCW.
Well, Drew, thank you so much for coming on to Wrestle Tea. This has been one of my more serious conversations, I'd say, that I've had on Wrestle Tea. Very informative. I'm sure that the fans will bite right into this. For those of you who do not follow Beyond Wrestling, please do so on YouTube, because we are going to have a part 2 interview between Drew and I, and we're not going to discuss what we're going to broach in terms of topics, but it's going to be just as good and just as juicy as what we've discussed on Wrestle Tea today. So keep an eye out for a future part 2 interview on Beyond Wrestling's YouTube.
And I think what would be super helpful, Sam, too, is if people can leave comments with questions that they may have of different topics that they want us to address in the follow-up interview. You know, maybe if something that I spoke about today needs to be clarified, or maybe if it's giving you a different idea about the way wrestling's moving. Like, please, if you've watched this entire interview, first of all, thank you, for giving us your time. But please leave a comment with a question, and it'll kind of help us form the direction, that the interview goes for when we bring Wrestle Tea to the Beyond Wrestling YouTube channel.
Absolutely. Sound off below. I will catalog all of your comments, and we will get something going for our part 2 interview. Thank you so much, Drew.
Thank you.